On May 20th, Laichinter took office as the new leader of the Taiwan region. He gave a so-called inauguration speech during which he expressed explicit views on Taiwan separatism. His speech triggered strong reaction from the central government in Beijing, with a spokesperson calling his stance radical. Lai called himself a guardian of peace for the world, as Taiwan sits on a strategic position on the so-called first island chain in the Pacific Ocean. But will his radical views contribute to peace across the straits or the opposite? What do peace-loving people in Taiwan think of his speech? Welcome to this special edition of The Point with me, Li Xin, coming to you from Beijing. I'm pleased to be joined by Huang Qixian, a well-known TV commentator in Taiwan, joining me from Nanking in southern China. Ms. Huang, welcome to The Point. What kind of cross-strait strategy does Laichinter's so-called inaugural speech demonstrate, and how does it compare to his predecessor Tsai Ing-wen's approach?
Laichinter's personality and background are different from Tsai Ing-wen's, so his strategies have some continuity, which is to maintain the so-called status quo, and also some slight differences. Firstly, what remains unchanged? He upholds Tsai Ing-wen's path, fully inheriting it. However, even the same words spoken by Laichinter and Tsai Ing-wen carry different significance and weight, because we, who have long observed them in Taiwan, know them too well. The same words spoken by different people with different expressions ultimately yield completely different results.
美国跟日本对中国大陆的恶意。
The second difference lies in the level of hostility of the United States and Japan towards the Chinese mainland, which has changed from 8 years ago when Tsai Ing-wen took office. The U.S. reviewed Laichinter's speech down to the punctuation, even his last-minute changes. What does this mean? Lai is essentially a watchdog for the U.S. Everything he says mirrors American intentions. His opinions are purely U.S.-driven, with the U.S. and Japan acting as his guardians. It's the U.S. and Japan that truly worries and angers me.
是美国跟日本。第三个是赖清德在微微的往前走，所以他所讲的。
The third point is Laichinter is gradually taking steps towards Taiwan independence. When he says the mainland and Taiwan are not subordinate to each other, what he falsely implies is that the so-called Taiwan independence has already been achieved. While Lai appears to maintain the so-called status quo, he has taken a few steps towards Taiwan independence. It's a very clear signal. Furthermore, Lai clearly indicates his intention to integrate Taiwan into the U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy, especially in technology and industry chains. In particular, regarding industry chains, Lai aims to fully align with the U.S.-dominated industry chain that excludes the mainland, using all of Taiwan's strength to assist the U.S. Although Lai talks about democracy and dignity, he still wants to earn money from the mainland, saying that we need exchanges, we need mainland tourists and students to come to Taiwan.
How do people in Taiwan react to Lai's advocating that the so-called Republic of China and the People's Republic of China are not subordinate to each other? How do you look at this?
Taiwan's public opinion is divided and torn due to one election after another. People in Taiwan are in a very painful state of national identity division. When I was a child, the number of people in Taiwan who identified themselves as Chinese was almost 100%. However, under the long-term brainwashing of the so-called Taiwan independence by the Democratic Progressive Party, the number has gradually decreased. The number of people who believe that China will be reunified has also decreased. This is why Laichinter dares to lean towards the U.S. and Japan to promote the so-called Taiwan independence. However, There's still many people in Taiwan who oppose the so-called Taiwan independence. The mainstream public opinion in Taiwan hopes to maintain the status quo. Laichinte's model advocates to neither yield nor provoke and maintain the status quo. But when he talks about maintaining the so-called status quo, what he means is to maintain the current situation of gradually moving towards the so-called Taiwan independence and lean towards the U.S. The status quo that the vast majority of people in Taiwan hope to maintain is peace across the straits. In the context after Laichinte's speech, those in favor of the so-called Taiwan independence cheered and applauded, while those against it were very angry. Like me, I'm very angry, indignant, and I vehemently denounce Laichinter. Each election only further divides Taiwan society. There's no way around it.
So he always talks about he represents the will of the Taiwan people, but only around 70% of voters turn out to vote in the last presidential contest, and about 40% voted for the DPP. Could he, and if you put those two numbers together, that means less than 30% of registered voters in Taiwan support the DPP, support Mr. Lai. Could he represent the majority view of the Taiwan people?
You mentioned an interesting figure, and it involves a crucial thing. The key word is majority. Taiwan's voter turnout of 70% is considered high, but it means that 30% of people did not come out to vote. Therefore, their intentions cannot be reflected in the ballots. Despite Laichinte's efforts, he only received 40% among those who voted. Even if we don't consider the 30% who didn't vote, among the 70% who did, Laichinter only secured 40%, which is far below 50% of all registered voters in Taiwan, not even half. Therefore, he certainly cannot represent Taiwan. Within the 70% who voted, 60% clearly had the option to vote for Laichinter, but chose not to. Why? Because they don't want Laichinter. They don't support him. Laichinter knew it on January 13th. The majority of people in Taiwan are not pleased with him becoming a leader, nor with the Democratic Progressive Party's so-called Taiwan independence stance. However, due to Taiwan's electoral system, he secured that position. Yet, the DPP does not hold a majority in Taiwan's legislative body, and many of its policies that are conducive to the so-called Taiwan independence and against the mainland will not pass. It's just not possible. I think, therefore, that despite Laichinter's assertiveness and his continuation of Tsai Ing-wen's path, he has been hobbled from May 20th, the very day he took office, because he doesn't have the support of the legislative body.
But still, Mr. Lai has been calling himself as a so-called pragmatic worker for Taiwan independence. What does it mean for the future of Taiwan and for the future of cross-strait relations?
赖清德应该很多次后悔，他曾经讲过，他是务实的台独工作者这句话。
Laichinter once said he was a pragmatic worker for Taiwan independence, a statement he must have regretted many times since. Later, he repeatedly explained the statement in his own defense. He's now very cautious, but still, one's earlier words often best represent the true self. His so-called pragmatic worker means he will weigh the risks and try to promote the so-called Taiwan independence as much as possible. This is his main cause, but he doesn't want to start a war. This attitude is expressed in his speech. He didn't say Taiwan independence outright, but he wrapped it in other words, making it clear he's on that path.
它是包裹成其他的文字，但是让你很清楚的知道他走的就是台独之路，对不对？他讲互不隶属嘛，他讲说我们是和。
He talks about the two sides across the straits not subordinate to each other and the legal government chosen by Taiwan's people, while constantly calling for peace and dialogue. What does this mean? Laichinter wants the so-called Taiwan independence. If anyone opposes him, they're the ones destroying peace. This is where he turns to sophistry, Such an attitude is certainly detrimental to Taiwan's medium to long-term development and even to Taiwan's current situation.
的立场都是不利的，但是它背后有谁在推着它呢？是美国啊。
But who's behind it? It's the U.S. Taiwan's economy has now entered a state that seems bright on the outside, but is internally rotten. For example, Taiwan's economy looks very prosperous, and the stock market breaks 20,000 points for the first time. But there's something fishy about it. First, as the stock market rises, the benefits go to a small number of tech companies. Taiwan's high-tech industry occupies too large a proportion of all industries. The drawback is that the high-tech industry requires enormous investment. An investment of 20 billion new Taiwan dollars might only create 20 billion new Taiwan dollars in returns. So its contribution to employment is very low, and the ones who benefit are the capitalists. The second issue is that Taiwan's GDP growth in 2023 was only about 1.5%. What's more, Taiwan's GDP calculation includes production from overseas, which is essentially a form of cheating. Even with the inclusion of overseas production capacity, we only saw a growth of 1.5% last year. The reality is that while the real estate industry and stock prices are soaring, wages remain stagnant, which is bizarre. Additionally, many service industries are closing down because they can't afford to pay high wages. Recently, numerous long-standing businesses in Taiwan have shut down because they couldn't afford the salaries of highly paid service personnel. What does this signify? It indicates that Taiwan's core has been hollowed out. Young people can't find jobs that match their skills. They're left with no options. The most alarming aspect is that the booming industry in Taiwan now is a fraud business. Because only in the fraud business you can earn such high salaries. That's the current situation in Taiwan. And Taiwan is following the United States, moving high technology industries such as TSMC to the US under its pressure and demand. When TSMC moves, it takes with it both upstream and downstream suppliers, as well as high-income engineers. Thousands of engineers from TSMC have already moved to the US, and many of its suppliers are also following suit. TSMC's establishment of a plant in Kumamoto, Japan, has drawn away another group of people. Taiwan's entire industrial structure is severely imbalanced, with only the semiconductor industry standing out. And now, even the semiconductor sector is being drained. That's the current situation in Taiwan. If Taiwan cannot fully integrate itself with the mainland, Taiwan actually has no way forward.
In his speech, Mr. Lai mentioned democracy or democratic 31 times, and even said he wants Taiwan to become the MVP, most valued player of the democratic world. Why did he emphasize democracy so many times? And given what we're seeing in the so-called legislature, the brawl that was happening, clearly Taiwan's democracy is not so vibrant. Maybe physical is the more appropriate word to describe it.
我觉得台湾的民主是个骗局。
I think Taiwan's democracy is a scam in every aspect. When Laixingde talks about democracy, he has three main purposes. First, he's following in the footsteps of Li Tenghui, who is referred to as the so-called Mr. Democracy of Taiwan, which is a joke. Why did Li Tenghui talk about democracy? It was to use democracy to package the path towards the so-called Taiwan independence. He used democracy to justify his purpose, to make it appear legitimate. On the surface, it's all about democracy. Who can oppose democracy? No one in the world can oppose the concept of democracy. So people naively follow the path of democracy, not realizing that it's actually the path to so-called Taiwan independence. I have been highly interested in politics since I was very young. I have experienced the role of Chiang Kai-shek and Chiang Ching-kuo, the so-called authoritarian rule. I have also witnessed the struggles of the Democratic Progressive Party and other opposition parties. I've seen both the Kuomintang and the DPP in power back and forth. One person, one vote election is not entirely without benefits. I acknowledge that. I have experienced and observed many elections. But it has a very frightening inherent limitation. One person, one vote paired with capitalism will ultimately lead to plutocracy. In many places in Taiwan, the practice of buying votes is still prevalent. Initially, it might involve offering 500 or 1,000 new Taiwan dollars per vote, and over time, this practice has become very mature. Those involved often collaborate with local thugs and gangsters. They may come to your house dressed in a windbreaker, and if they offer you a red envelope, you dare not refuse. Concealed within their clothes may be a gun. And if you accept the red envelope for a family of 6, for instance, you end up casting 6 votes as instructed. They have ways to track if you have indeed voted according to their wishes. So, this happens when there's no remote voting available at the local level. Furthermore, after a couple of elections, you end up with many political families at the local level, where power is passed down from grandfather to son, daughter, grandson, and granddaughter. Eventually, the entire family fully controls various aspects of local affairs. For example, if I get elected, my opponents won't want me to succeed, so they badmouth me every day. Why? Because I might reward my major donors, reward my supporters, and my faction benefits while the opposing faction suffers. So the opponents won't let me have a smooth ride. When, by chance, the opponents get elected someday, I'll badmouth them as well. I have my own supporters. So the whole society is perpetually divided because each side wants to secure its own profits. Meanwhile, the gangsters can gradually whitewash themselves legally by bribing politicians and eventually run for elections themselves. Elections cost money, advertisements cost money, hiring online trolls costs money, getting people to do things for you costs money. So the candidates have to go everywhere to raise funds. Why would people give them money? Because they hope that these candidates will repay them when they get elected. So ultimately, power and money are intertwined. It's difficult to distinguish between the two. We've seen too much of this, for example. If I support someone, I'll ask him to modify certain laws. I'll demand that during the bidding process, I can win the projects, and in the end, everything will be tied together. So, what can ordinary people actually decide? Ordinary people only feel like they have power at the moment of voting, but when they go to vote and open the ballot, they will find that they are not satisfied with any of the candidates. The candidates might all have criminal records or other issues, yet the ordinary people have no other choice. That's the situation. People can't truly make decisions. They're stuck with options they don't like.
Do you think that America is having a hidden influence there? Because it seems that every candidate, if they really want to be a hopeful winner, they have to go and get approval from the United States or job interview in Washington.
美国当然有 influence， 而且它不是一个 hidden influence， 它不是一个隐藏的影响力。
The U.S. certainly has influence, and it's not a hidden influence. It's a tangible monopolistic control. The American Institute in Taiwan regularly meets with various figures in Taiwan and has very strong and direct control over Taiwan's political direction. To be honest, this even extends to the media. I have personal experience with this. If the American Institute in Taiwan has an issue with certain media outlets or political figures, it can be disastrous for those targeted. As a result, U.S. control means that people in Taiwan are even less able to influence their own future. The idea that the people of Taiwan are in charge or that they could elect their leaders is, of course, a joke. But speaking of the U.S. own elections, it's also a joke. So, Taiwan suffers from 2 major issues. First, the one person, one vote system combined with money and capitalism fails to bring a proper balance to politics. The second is foreign influence. Apart from the U.S., Japan also has strong control over Taiwan's political scene. No political figures in Taiwan dare to offend the U.S. or Japan.
Could you talk a little bit about the influence of Japan over the politics in Taiwan? Because we don't talk about that enough. We know that there were 50 years of colonial rule of Japan before the end of the Second World War. But how has that influence penetrated the surface and stayed on and strong in Taiwan?
日本他看台湾的心情是非常复杂。
Japan has very complex feelings toward Taiwan. Even today, Japan still regards Taiwan as a source of pain. It still sees Taiwan as its so-called former southern national borderline, a place it cannot easily let go of or give up. After Taiwan's recovery from Japanese occupation in 1945, Japan's influence in Taiwan remained due to various historical reasons. Although the Japanese left, those people who had collaborated with the Japanese remained. They maintained close business relations with Japan. And the Kuomintang needed political stability to govern Taiwan and thus required Japan's support. Most of the older generation in Taiwan can speak Japanese, and their lifestyle was influenced by the Japanese. Therefore, their aesthetics and nostalgia have a little bit of a connection with Japan. This is one aspect. The second aspect is the economic and trade impact on Taiwan over several decades. Japan has constantly maintained a trade surplus with Taiwan, earning significant revenue, which has led to larger investments in various sectors such as real estate, banking, manufacturing, department stores, and heavy industries. And Japanese investments have extended to influencing Taiwan politicians, thus impacting Taiwan's political landscape. Thirdly, Japan is highly secretive about various industrial secrets, resulting in an industrial chain where Japan holds the patents and know-how upstream, Taiwan does the manufacturing in the middle, and then it moves downstream. This forms a community of shared interests. Furthermore, Japan is both fearful and reluctant to see the mainland become powerful. Thus, it has long supported Taiwan's independence forces. There have always been two factions within the Taiwan independence movement, one backed by Japan and the other by the US. Despite their similarities, there are slight differences between these two pro-independence factions. Laijingde himself is part of the Japanese faction, but is also backed by the US. Why? Because there are churches in the city of Tainan in southern Taiwan, specifically the Presbyterian Church, which is the US-backed independence faction. And the Presbyterian Church supports Laijingde. Shelby Kim's father was a pastor in a Presbyterian church and was very pro-independence. Her mother is American. Thus, these forces are very strong. And Laijingde himself puts a lot of effort into cultivating relations with Japan. After Japan's former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe was assassinated, Abe's family privately invited Laijingde to Japan to offer his condolences, highlighting the relationship between them. During Laijingde's so-called inauguration, Shinzo Abe's widow also traveled to Taiwan as one of the attendees. So, similar to many Taiwan politicians, regardless of their affiliations with either the blue or green camps, Lai works diligently to cultivate relations with Japan.
Well, some people will say, well, look, the mainland has been saying China will be reunified. China will be reunified. It will happen. So they say, okay, no matter what, China wants to reunify itself, then it's going to use force if by a certain date that doesn't happen. Therefore, Taiwan needs to cooperate with external forces, be it the United States or Japan, to defend itself so that there is no war, that the mainland cannot use force to achieve reunification. How do you react to that?
Absolutely nonsense. When Catalonia sought independence from Spain, did Spain allow it? Did the EU allow it? No, they didn't. It's a simple truth. After World War II, the concept of national self-determination emerged. An ethnic group or country that was once independent and then invaded or colonized certainly has the right to self-determination, independence, and the restoration of its nationhood. But Taiwan has always been Chinese territory. Our ancestors came from the mainland. Why does Laijingde say he is a pragmatic worker for Taiwan independence? He implies that he doesn't need to change the name of Taiwan since Taiwan independence has been achieved. However, the fact is he doesn't dare to change the name of Taiwan. So, when Laixingter says China should recognize the existence of the so-called Republic of China is nonsense. It's the ravings of a madman. The current cross-strait situation is caused by the Chinese Civil War. It remains unresolved. How will the U.S. resolve its civil war? Will the U.S. allow any state to seek independence? It's impossible. So, how to avoid war? It's simple. No Taiwan independence, no war. The U.S. is reversing cause and effect, distorting right and wrong, and calling a deer a horse. By doing so, the U.S. can cheaply use Taiwan to confront China. Using Chinese people to fight against Chinese people is the most cost-effective strategy.
利用台湾来对付中国，用自己人对付自己人，这是最廉价。
All right, we're going to leave it there. Many thanks to Huang Zhixian, a famous TV commentator from Taiwan. And with that, we come to the end of this special edition of The Point with me, Li Xin, coming to you from Beijing. As always, you can follow me on Facebook and Twitter or X using the handle Li Xin in Beijing. On behalf of the whole team, thank you for watching.